Right, so I know it's only been about a week since the last character analysis video, which is kind of unusual. And here's the thing, sometimes I have a bit of a vague plan as to what videos are upcoming on the channel across potentially the next month. And then sometimes I'm just like, no, actually, I just want to talk about this today for some reason. And this time, I really wanted to talk about a vice captain, as I feel like outside of the kind of major vice captains like Renji, Rukia, Hisagi, etc., haven't really spoken about them too much, and they are a major faction in Bleach, and so I kind of wanted to pick one of the vice captains who is perhaps slightly more underrepresented. And so today we're going to have a character analysis video on the vice captain of the 8th division and then the co-vice captain of the 1st division, Nanao Ise. She wasn't voted for or anything like that. This really is just a spontaneous thing that I wanted to talk about today, which is part of the fun of having a channel like this, although I will put out a poll for the next character analysis video after this one pretty soon. Before we get started, however, if you haven't hit subscribe yet, make sure to do that now, as you are in the perfect place for Bleach content like this every week. And also, if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up as well, because that really does help the video on YouTube. It gets it more exposure, and it means that more Bleach fans like yourselves get a chance to see it. And if you want to take that support for me another step further, we do have a Patreon for the channel as well now, where you can get access to videos just like this one early, and you can support me for as little as $1 a month if you want to help out what I do here on the channel. And everyone on screen at the moment is already doing just that, so an enormous thank you to all of you. So a minute ago when I mentioned about Nanao's representation throughout the series, and I said that she was underrepresented, I think that is quite fair. I would say there's definitely something of a sliding scale of representation among, well, kind of all the characters in Bleach, but if we look solely at the vice captains, you know, you've got your ultra popular characters who are a major focus of a lot of the series, Renji, Rukia while she's a vice captain, Hisagi, you know, characters again who aren't vice captains the whole time but hold that kind of prominence and then eventually become vice captains like Ikkaku, and then you've got Matsumoto, characters like that as well. And then you've got a sliding scale, you've got characters kind of in the middle, like I would say Omaida, for instance, who gets a decent amount of screen time, but no, not as much as those guys. And then at the very bottom, you have the likes of Sasakibe, poor old Chojuro Sasakibe. And I would also argue characters like Tetsuzaimon, Iba as well, which is a bit of a shame because those guys are cool. And as far as I'm concerned, Nanao probably fits squarely in that center part of the scale. That's mostly thanks to her kind of expanded role in the Thousand Year Blood War arc. If you kind of go off her role throughout the story's earlier story arcs, I could even argue her being in the bottom end of that scale, which is why I think it's kind of good to discuss her now. So her manga lifespan ranges from chapter 102 in the Soul Society arc right the way to the very end of the series to the penultimate chapter of 685, although she does also appear in the brand new Hell chapter as well, which honestly I just kind of wish was called 687 because it would make my life a lot easier. In terms of her appearance and personality, she's one of the more understated Shinigami for sure. She certainly has her own unique look, almost like every other character does in the series. We've mentioned it before, but Kubo nails it with character designs almost all the time. Nanao is no exception, but she's definitely slightly more subtle and subdued in the way she looks, which I guess kind of goes quite well with her character, who is quite straightforward, quite cold in a way, quite calculating and uniform, and I think that fits her quite well. She's got this whole kind of librarian look going on, very big spectacles, quite neat hairstyle, and she's almost always carrying a massive tome under her arm as well, and I really like that. I think it's a cool look. Obviously, in terms of her appearance, she shares some superficial elements with Lisa Yadomaru, which is a fairly important part of her character, but aside from that, she is pretty much wholly unique, and I really enjoy her outward appearance. I think, like I said, she is unique enough while being quite downplayed in general, which I think is obviously done on purpose to contrast with her very eccentric, very flamboyant captain, Kyoraku. And actually, I want to just talk briefly about the way Kubo portrays the relationships between captain and vice captain, because I think it's often falls into one of two camps. Either the captain and the vice captain, complement each other almost perfectly. Both Yamamoto and Sasakibe are quite similar characters overall, and the same again goes for Komamura and Iba. Or the captain and the vice captain are near total opposites. And, examples of that would be characters like Byakuya and Renji. You have the upper class symbol of the nobility and then the kind of dog of the Rukongai, Renji. And, obviously, Kyoraku and Nanao fall into that second category. Kyoraku is the outgoing, often very drunk party lover, whereas Nanao is the administrator of the division. She's the one doing all the paperwork. She's the one who doesn't put up with any of Kyoraku's nonsense. And I like that. They have a really nice dynamic, and it's a dynamic that Kubo clearly enjoys as well, as we see it a few times throughout the series. It's kind of like the inverse of Hitsugaya and Matsumoto, to some degree. And so Nanao doesn't have the biggest role in the story. We don't get to see necessarily loads of her personality, and what we do see, like I said, fits into that kind of stereotype of the stern librarian or teacher or something like that, who, has to kind of smack around the kids who are messing around. But we do get a little bit more in the 1,000-Year Blood War arc. We get to really see Nanao step up to a role of a commander-like figure in some respects, which we'll get into in the plot overview. And we also get to see her perspective in battle as well, which I found to be really interesting. And so in regards to her plot overview then, she doesn't do a huge amount in the story, perhaps outside of the 1,000-Year Blood War. She has a decent role in that. But like I said, she first appears in the Soul Society arc when Chad is emerging on the 8th Division. He's beating up characters like Tatsufasa and Joji, and this again synergizes nicely with the last character analysis video I did on Chad, who has a big role with the 8th Division in this first major story arc. Nanao helps introduce her captain to Chad. There's a lovely moment, and again, Kubo is incredibly good and deft at these character interactions that really help you nail down exactly what their dynamic is, kind of the moment you see them. And I love the fact that Kyoraku clearly planned out this very kind of theatrical entrance in front of Chad. He lands on the ground, you can't really see his face. Flower petals are like dropping elegantly and gracefully around him, and he's like talking to Chad in this very mysterious way, but then the petals keep coming and they keep speeding up, and he's like, Nanao, that's probably enough. And she's like not really giving, she doesn't care about any of this nonsense. She just wants them to do their job, and she just dumps all the petals on him in one go. It's lovely, lovely little character moments and character interactions like that helped the Gotei 13 feel so real, I think. And it's reasons like that they are so popular as a faction as a whole. And this is just such a great example of that. And it immediately establishes the dynamic between the two of them. And there is a little bit more prior to that as well, where Nanao notices that Ryoka is coming and thinks that they should just go out and deal with him, and Kyoraku kind of talks to her about her demeanour and stuff like that in his kind of very condescending and patronising way that often ends with him getting smacked. So Nanao doesn't have really any role to play in the fight with Chad. She is the one who receives the information about Aizen's murder from the Right Aid Thai member. And so when the fight with Chad comes to an end, she notices that Kyoraku has decided to leave him alive, and she's not really having any of it. She moves to actually finish Chad off. We don't really know what she's going to do. She sort of holds her hand up in a sinister way and seems to be collecting Reiatsu around it. Whether she was just going to actually strike Chad with her hand imbued with Reiatsu, or if she was going to perform some kind of Kido spell, which would obviously make a lot of sense for her character. Unfortunately, we never find out, as Kyoraku stops her from committing the act, saying it's not particularly ladylike to finish off someone who, can't move. And this, I think, is a really interesting scene that actually sets the tone for both their relationship, and it kind of explores their worldview and mindset and how they differ in that regard. Nanao protests immediately, saying, he's part of the Ryoka, he must be part of the group responsible for Aizen's death. Again, very straightforward, very black and white, very logical way of thinking. But Kyoraku is completely the opposite of that, and he is incredibly perceptive, and I just always love this scene because I think it's extraordinarily telling of Kyoraku's character as he kind of holds her wrist and stops her from attacking Chad. And the logical answer is Chad's group, the Ryoka, the invaders, must have killed a captain. And so Kyoraku's like, yeah, probably, but also possibly not. And I really love that. I love that moment where you don't think for a second that Kyoraku actually thinks these guys are capable of killing a captain. Not because they can't, but more because that's not in their nature. Even after just dealing with Chad for a little while, Kyoraku, I think understands that they are not bad people. And so he's kind of like, I think the truth, we need to uncover the truth as to what's actually going on. And that kind of mindset really separates them, I think, as to why she's a vice captain and he's a captain. And obviously the power difference, but I think in terms of a mental kind of examination of how these characters actually tick, I really like seeing that, just the way that Nanao jumps to the most logical conclusion and was ready to finish off Chad as a result, and Kyoraku stops her. I really do like that. And this carries on as well when Kyoraku is conflicted by Rukia's execution and doesn't know if he thinks he should allow it to go on or not. And Nanao, despite, believing in justice and authority, is very much willing to stand by her captain. She's willing to stand by his side, even if she's anticipating him making a slightly, maybe stupid move. She's always going to be there for him. And again, I like that. I like their understanding of each other, even if they are very different people. And so towards the end of the Soul Society arc, once Kyoraku and Ukitake have helped prevent Rukia's execution, they flee the area to kind of try and take the raging Yamamoto to a more desolate place for a fight. They know there's going to be a showdown, and Nanao sort of chases after them. Kyoraku teases her on the fact that she came in last and that she's not as fast as they are. But then, of course, she notices that Yamamoto is already there and was waiting for them in anticipation. And there's kind of a weird moment here where Nanao kind of basically looks at the scene unfolding in front of her, and she thinks to herself, like, I don't know if these two captains can actually defeat Yamamoto. And this was back during a time where the story's overall power was kind of significantly simplified. It was more a case of, if they're a captain, they're immensely powerful. And, you were to believe that two captains together would be nigh unbeatable. And that's kind of the opinion that Nanao gives as well. She sort of is like, even two captains, they might not be able to defeat Yamamoto, being the captain commander. And then she says, there's only one thing I can do to help. And she sort of reaches into her uniform as if she's about to do something that she actively thinks can help hinder Yamamoto of all characters, but he immediately quashes her with his immeasurable reiatsu. Like, he just completely crushes her with this immense pressure. In the manga, it's actually quite graphic. She falls to the ground, her eyes are rolling up into the back of her head, tears streaming down her face. It really looks like Yamamoto's basically just going to kill her simply by exerting his power. And he says, I don't have time to teach babies like you how to breathe. Obviously by proxy of her being Kyoraku's vice captain, he's enraged with her as well. And I think this is really cool. It's no slight against Nanao. I think any of the vice captains at this point in the story would crumble like this if Yamamoto actually targeted them with his pressure. And so I think it's really strange that Nanao seems to think she can do something to hinder Yamamoto, to the point where she was actively reaching into her uniform to presumably draw something out to use against him. Now, we never see Nanao's Zanpakuto in the canon manga until much later on in the Thousand Year Blood War, where it's basically confirmed she doesn't actually own one of her own. It's my assumption that she is probably planning to use her Zanpakuto here, especially since there is a splash promo page of the vice captains at one point revealed where she is drawing a Zanpakuto from her sleeve. Clearly, at one point, he intended for her to have a standard Zanpakuto like the other captains, and then eventually scrapped that idea in the Thousand Year Blood War arc. So I'm guessing that's what she was going to use, and if that is the case, I'm really intrigued as to what Kubo's plan for her Zanpakuto might have been, if he even had one, or if it was just supposed to be a slight tease, a slight cliffhanger as to what she could actually do as a vice captain. But regardless, it's still a pretty weird scene, particularly when you look at it in retrospect. But Kyoraku manages to rescue her from this. He jumps in between the two of them and he apologises to Nanao for bringing her along and, thinking it was quite irresponsible of him. And while this is the right thing for him to do here, this is one of many examples, I think, of Kyoraku actively sheltering Nanao from battle and in many ways, I think, perhaps costing her own growth in that regard, which is something we will get to towards the end of the 1,000-Year Blood War arc. But Kyoraku does seem to have a habit of shielding Nanao away from very dangerous, or even potentially dangerous, situations. But he takes her away from the battle, and she kind of, while she's recovering slowly, panting heavily, comes to the realization that she was a fool to think that they might have stood a chance. They do not stand a chance in hell against Yamamoto. So I want to touch briefly before we move on that point I made just then about Kyoraku sheltering Nanao from potentially dangerous situations. And I have to wonder if this idea of him really trying to protect her stems from what happened to Lisa in the Turn Back the Pendulum arc. And actually, this is a grief that I really wish had been explored, because Kyoraku must blame himself entirely for what happened to her, you have to assume, because originally Tessai Tsukabishi was going to go to that battlefield 100 years ago and he would have been hollified, but Kyoraku actually basically says, don't send Tessai, send my vice captain Lisa, she's ready for it instead. Now Lisa is consenting in wanting to go, she was eavesdropping on the captain's meeting basically in the hope that she would go anyway. But, you have to assume, because obviously Kyoraku and Lisa had a very close relationship, you have to assume he felt, just destroyed when she didn't come back that night. And in fact is exiled and disappears from the Soul Society completely without a trace. Their eventual reunion in the Fate Karakura Town arc is perhaps more than anything played up for laughs, so I think it would have been really powerful to see how he felt in the immediate aftermath of that, and I do wonder if that's now why he keeps Nanao away from situations like that. And speaking of keeping Nanao away from these kind of situations, she basically doesn't appear at all in the Arrancar arc, which is really, really strange. And I actively have a memory of thinking to myself, like, while the Arrancar arc was ongoing, Fate Karakura Town was unspooling week by week, I remember thinking at one point, I was like, I completely forgot Nanao even existed. Like, I totally forgot this character was even a thing. Because she basically just isn't around. She doesn't take part in any of the Fate Karakura Town stuff, and that's when basically half of the Gotei 13 shows up, because the other half show up for a bit in Waco Mundo, but the majority of the Shinigami's face time in that arc is during that battle, and clearly Kyoraku has kept her away. Again, I would assume, trying to shelter her from the idea that she might be killed during the Fate Karakura Town fight. That's the only thing I can think of why she wouldn't be there. She does make an appearance in Turn Back the Pendulum at least, though, so it kind of shows that Kubo didn't forget about her, since that takes place right before the war actually begins. You get this nice moment where you see her, she's like a really young girl, tiny little kid, 100 years ago, and she kind of approaches Kyoraku in the middle of the night, basically being like, where's Lisa? We were supposed to read together tonight, which is nice, because it kind of shows that these two characters did have some kind of a relationship in the past. There's more to it than them just looking very similar. But Kyoraku, he's like, oh, she's out on a very important mission, but she'll be back tomorrow. Obviously, she never was. And so we can assume from that point on that Nanao eventually worked her way up to becoming his vice captain. And I have to assume that Kyoraku basically decided he would never let anything like this happen again, which is why Nanao is nowhere to be seen. In fact, her next appearance isn't really until the 1,000-Year Blood War arc, where she does play, actually, a pretty substantial role, all things considered. And actually, when you take a look at the 1,000-Year Blood War arc as a whole, one of the best things about it, in my opinion, and I've always had this opinion, is Kubo's commendable effort to try and include as many characters as he can. Sometimes that's a recipe for disaster, but where characters like Nanao are concerned, it really gives them a chance to actually do something, and actually have some kind of a role. And were it not for the 1,000-Year Blood War, I would have her down at the end of that scale with the likes of Chojuro, Iba, and, even characters like Isane, although Isane is another one who does actually do a little bit more, particularly in this arc. And it makes a lot of sense for Nanao to have an expanded role in this arc, because she starts taking on the role of something of a proxy commander, and that makes a lot of sense because obviously she, along with her captain, after the first Quincy invasion, is moved to Squad 1. They basically take up the mantle of the kind of leaders of the Gotei 13. She obviously takes on the role of the vice captain, along with Genshiro Okikiba from Chojuro Sasakibe. And so, much like Kyoraku when he gets the news of the fact that he's been promoted to the Captain Commander after Yamamoto's death, Nanao is also shouldering a lot more responsibility all of a sudden, and much like her captain, she is the face of a new age Gotei 13. We don't really see the effects of this responsibility on Nanao quite like we do with Kyoraku, but she does take a prominent role at the forefront of the Gotei 13 a couple of times in this arc, which is really nice to see. But when the Vandenreich invades for a second time, their big, proper invasion where they replace the Seirei with their own territory, Nanao is there in the Squad 1 barracks when they are confronted by Yugrum Hashwolf, the liaison to Yhwach himself and the Grand Master of the Sternritter. In a sense, this is about as dangerous a situation as she could probably end up in. This guy is clearly very bad news, although Hashwolf himself, not that Kyoraku would know this, but he is quite a subdued individual and is probably not the most dangerous Sternritter to come up against purely from a personality perspective. But Nanao still holds her own here and actually gets a decent opportunity to really show what she's capable of. Now this is when Nanao's skill with Kido really starts becoming the focus of her character. She's there clutching her tome, and you get this kind of idea of her being like a witch or like a spellcaster, which I think is honestly really cool. And actually, because she's supposedly so proficient with Kido, I'd have liked to have seen her using it even more. Kido itself, very underused in Bleach. And the Kido she does use is just not really that interesting, which is a big shame, although it is practical, which again is very much Nanao's character, practical, logical. But basically she creates this barrier to block Hashwolf, and I like that she adds a bit of flourish to it as well. It has the symbol for the 1st Division in there, but like surrounded by the symbol of the Kido Corps, which I think is really neat, and I'm guessing that's something she just decided to add in there when she developed the spell. But Hashwolf, tries to sort of tap it with his blade and realises that there's no way he can get in. It seems to be purpose-built to actually stop a Quincy from being able to break through it easily. But over time, he does shave away the Ryatsu to the point where he's able to smash through the barrier. And Kyoraku kind of jumps in front of Nanao immediately, like he prepares himself. And again, this is me kind of thinking Kyoraku is really worried about Nanao all the time and is sheltering her. He can't really dismiss her because she is actively here wanting to fight alongside him, fight for the fate of the Soul Society. But there's no denying that the moment it looks like Hashwolf is about to make a move, Kyoraku's like, okay, that's it. That's probably enough now. You've done your thing. I'll take it from here. And I kind of like that, and I think it feeds into the idea we'll get into at the end of this arc. But before Hashwolf can really do anything, a second Kido barrier pops up in front of him, this one now made out of tessellated shapes. And he realizes himself that actually this is weaker in foundation because obviously Nanao has had less time to put it together, but actually he surmises that perhaps a trap has been included within to kind of compensate for the fact that it's a weaker wall than it was before. But before any of this can kind of continue, Hashwolf is eventually called away. And there's a kind of a weird moment as well where he basically says to her, do any of the other Shinigami know how to perform these spells? Because they are quite adept at stopping Quincy. They are purpose-built to prevent Quincy from moving forwards. And Nanao sort of reluctantly is like, well, no other Shinigami can use these spells. And it's just a bit weird that would be highlighted. It sort of feels like maybe Nanao was like studying away in secret and didn't really work with anyone else when really they probably should have been coming together a bit more. But regardless, it is still pretty cool to see her creating an ability that can even hold off the Grand Master of the Sternritter, albeit for a short time. As they then prepare for the final assault, this time on the Royal Palace, Nanao moves to the Shinigami's new stronghold, Mayuri's light-filled laboratory. And this is one of my favourite Nanao moments in the series, when she really steps up and kind of takes her place as the vice captain of the 1st Division. You know, a position that doesn't come without its fair share of gravitas. But basically, Kenpachi Zaraki, of all characters, is absolutely losing his mind over the fact that Yachiru is missing, presumably still on the battlefield somewhere, whereas the majority of the surviving upper echelon of the Gotei have all come together. It's a fair enough point. You can kind of understand why Kenpachi would be freaking out about the fact that Yachiru's been left out there somewhere. He doesn't know what's happened to her. And he tries to leave, but Kisuke can't let him go. You know, they need Zaraki to go to the Royal Palace, and he needs to do his job and put his feelings second. There's a really nice bit of inner turmoil, though, when Kenpachi turns around and is, like, furious that Kisuke is blocking his exit, and he kind of moves to attack him almost, when Nanao steps in front of him. And this is an interaction I don't think I ever anticipated seeing in the series. But basically, because Kyoraku isn't here at the moment, he is dealing with his own personal business, otherwise known as Aizen, and the Central 46, Nanao has kind of had to take his place as almost like the proxy captain commander of the entire Gotei 13. And I really like this, because Zaraki's got to be a pretty terrifying guy to stand up to, especially when he is incensed like this. You know, even Kisuke was starting to look a bit freaked out, but Nanao just gets in front of him and she's like, you need to stop this. You know, you need to think about your role as a captain. The guys, your squad members are already looking for out there, and they will be able to do it. They'll be able to cover more ground than you faster. We need you here. And Zaraki stares her down, she stares him down, unblinking, and eventually he's like, yeah, you're right, yep, fine, whatever, let's just get this over and done with, they'll find her faster than I will. And it's just a wonderful moment, because, like, you know, when Nanao gets in front of him like that, characters like Ikaku and Hisagi Umichika, for example, they are, like, terrified he's about to just cut her in half or something. And you get the feeling that there's, like, this palpable sense of relief after Kenpachi backs down, but the fact that Zaraki of all people relents to Nanao's command means that her respect has been earned, and it's well understood by everyone that, you know, she is a member of the 1st Division. Not just is she a member, she's one of the co-vice captains, and that isn't a position that doesn't come without its fair share of respect. And as they try and build the reishi door to the palace, there's a nice kind of almost fan-servicey moment for Nanao when she meets Lisa again. Nanao's kind of freaking out about the fact that they don't have enough spiritual pressure to build this door, but Lisa comes in and touches the orb as well, and she's like, we're in this together, we're not going to give up, and Nanao recognises her and stuff, and that's a really nice moment. It's one of those things that Kubo didn't have to do, but it enriches the story just by being there, so I'm really happy to see it. And now Kyoraku has returned, the Shinigami are in Varvelt, they are making their final attack against the Quincy, and after the Pernida fight has taken place, the main Gotei 13 force is making its way to the central tower, but they are being picked off one by Sternritter X, the X-axis, Lille Barro, the Quincy sniper. And Kyoraku decides, you know, I'm going to have to take this guy down because he's taking out so many of our people, and this is another big moment for the Captain Commander, because he needs to take on the responsibility to ensure that the rest of his men, essentially, can carry on forwards. And so he and Nanao basically go and fight this guy who has been picking off the rest of the Shinigami. And you get a nice moment where, once again, Nanao kind of acts as the voice of the Captain Commander's office. Basically, they're not sure if they need to kind of like wait around for Kyoraku or not, but Nanao goes back to the rest of them and she's like, you know, Kyoraku's fighting here, we're going to stay here, but you guys need to carry on. She's talking to Shinji, etc. And so they do just that, and I really like that, and I think it's just a really awesome development for Nanao. It kind of makes a lot of sense for her to be the voice of the Captain Commander in many ways, because she is very administrative, she's very kind of on the ball, and I really like that, and I love that she's given this kind of level of respect. But what comes next is probably Nanao's biggest moment in the series, I'd say unquestionably her biggest moment, where she helps Kyoraku take on Lille Barro himself. And it's pretty crazy because Lille Barro is probably one of the strongest characters in the entire series at this point, having turned into this angelic seraphim of heaven itself, already having outlived Kyoraku's Bankai, one of the most anticipated abilities in the series. But you get this nice moment where basically Kyoraku is literally about to die. He is passing away. Katen Kyokotsu is like, sleep now, we'll drift away together. And then he's suddenly shaken out of this stupor by Nanao, who has returned to the battlefield after speaking with the rest of the Shinigami. And she's like, you have to wake up right now, or you're going to die. And Lille Barro appears behind her looking incredibly sinister, and he's like, oh, okay, the vice captain has returned. It's very sinful of you to throw away the chance your captain gave you by sending you away. But of course, realising that Nanao is in danger spurs Kyoraku on, and he basically uses the Kage Oni ability to warp them both into a shadow, and they manage to avoid Lille Barro's attack. Once inside the shadow world of Kyoraku's Zanpakuto, Nanao reveals the truth that she's known all along, that Kyoraku made a promise to her late mother that he would never pass along her true Zanpakuto, the ceremonial sword of the Ise family of priests. And basically, he would never pass this on. This is something that he would take to the grave with him, because the sword supposedly curses all of the women of the Ise family to have, basically terrible things befall them. And so in this shadow world, Kyoraku relents, reveals that yes, this is true, this is something that actually happened. Kyokotsu removes that ceremonial sword from its face. And this is another really lovely moment. We get a ton of backstory here, most of it for Kyoraku, but some of it for the Ise family as well. You get a nice small panel of a child Nanao, or like a really young Nanao, overhearing her mother talking to Kyoraku about giving him the Ise sword for safekeeping, keeping it away from her daughter so the curse doesn't befall her as well. Her mother is executed by Central 46 for essentially losing a ceremonial artifact, and Kyoraku really feels the weight and the burden of the fact that everyone he's close to gives him something of importance and then passes away, and so he's kind of left with all these loose ends, essentially, these horrible feelings weighing on his heart from people who have all passed on. And he doesn't want the same thing to happen to Nanao, someone he cares for deeply but also has a familial relationship with as well. As it's revealed, he's actually her uncle, because her mother was married to his brother. So actually the two of them have an even closer relationship than was previously thought. However, despite Kyoraku's reluctance to involve her, and again, this comes back to the idea of him really sheltering her, not only from dangerous situations, but also from the truth, because he fears something terrible will happen to her. In light of this, however, Nanao actively makes the choice to wield the blade herself against Lille Barro. She says that I will take the curse of the Ise family. And this actually makes a lot of sense, this next bit. She basically turns to Kyoraku and she says, I'll take this blade because I know in my heart that the man I admire and adore so much would think a curse like this is just silly superstition. It's just nonsense and nothing will happen to me. And this, I think, is perfect. It makes a lot of sense. What she's basically saying is there's no such thing as the Ise family curse. It's rubbish. And as long as I believe this, I know you can think the same thing as well, and we can use this sword without recompense. And it makes a lot of sense. Nanao, again, very logical, very practical, very pragmatic, would never believe in a superstition like this. She's probably all about the facts. She believes what she can see, what she can read in a book and, actively showcase for herself. And she would think a curse like this is just silly superstition. We need to use this sword, so I'm going to use it, no matter what you want, no matter what you think, and you can't keep it from me because it's my birthright as a member of the Ise family of priests. And I really like that. I think it's a bit of a shame that the sword came out of nowhere. It is a deus ex machina, at the end of the day, something we have talked about on the channel before. This is definitely one of the biggest examples of this, because Lille Barro is basically undefeatable until it turns out that Nanao has this super hidden secret ceremonial sword. And some people have said, oh, the surname Ise implies that she would have something to do with a religious blade of some great significance, but in my opinion, that is not something that the vast, vast majority of readers would ever pick up on. It's a nice thing to find out later on, but it is just not something that anyone is ever really going to know, particularly outside of Japan. However, it does work here in the context, and I think the most important thing about this story twist is the added layer of depth it gives the characters involved. I like that Nanao takes control of her own destiny. She basically takes this sword despite knowing it could do something bad to her, and Kyoraku kind of has to swallow his protective, almost paternal feelings for Nanao and be like, very well, I'll pass this sword on to you, because with this sword, you can almost certainly win. And it's a pretty powerful moment. I remember reading it on the weekly. I was a little bit like, I'm not really sure how much I like any of this, because it did feel quite cheap. In some ways, it felt a little unearned. But I actually, going back, rereading it a few more times, it's something that grows on you, I think. And this fight as a whole has grown on me quite a lot. And I always feel a little bit disheartened when I hear people don't really like this fight, particularly because of the ending. But actually, I don't think it's that bad. I actually quite enjoy how it all comes together for the characters involved, for this main pairing of the two of them, captain and vice captain. The captain kind of giving over both his life and hers into her hands. I think that's really cool. And so, in essentially the finale of her story, Nanao emerges from the shadow on Lille Barro's face in a pretty awesome pose as well, I have to admit. That's a cool panel. And they kind of clash, and she reveals her blade, Shinken Hakkyoken, which is basically a blade covered in mirrors, which he's going to use to reflect God's light back at him in a very literal sense. And that's pretty much it. Basically, Nanao says that you are emanating a divine light, and this blade will reflect it back, and with it I can actually defeat you. And she kind of lunges at Lille. He deflects the strike, only to find it severed his arm completely. The light disperses, and she just kind of cuts through him like butter, basically. And he realizes that, oh, actually, okay, a sword like that is actually quite powerful, but you should have finished me off with that one hit, because now I'm going to absolutely decimate you. And you get another moment that was a little bit controversial right now, but I actually quite like it, where Nanao is like terrified. She's absolutely fear-stricken of not only Lille himself, but actually the act of battle, the act of being in the midst of a fight. She's been sliced. Basically, when she sliced Lille, the light shot off his body and struck her, probably like a piece of glass or something is how it would feel. And so she's got a lot of blood coming down her leg, and she's not used to this. She's never been in this kind of situation. She's like, it's so painful. I never thought wielding a sword would be so scary. I never thought facing an enemy would be this terrifying. And I think this actually, again, really works. Nanao is the kind of character who lives in her books. She's very much a bookworm. That's where something in the pages of a book is something she can actually control, and that's why she's so adept at Kido. It's something she can really manufacture and control to control something to her advantage. But being in a sword fight, it's far more primitive, it's far more brutal, and your life is on the line basically all the time. The moment you go in to clash blades with someone, you could be killed. Whereas using Kido feels a lot more safe. It feels a lot more disconnected from an actual fight scenario. So I really like this idea that Nanao's actually terrified of battle. I think it adds another dimension to her character, because she's not terrified of battle in the same way as someone like Hisagi is. She actually doesn't know that she's terrified until the moment comes, and then she's like, I can't even move, I'm so scared. And I think it really works. Because for someone who's basically never been involved in a fight like this, it feels like a very human, very real reaction to have. And again, if Kyoraku has actually been sheltering her from battle situations, it would completely explain why, now that she's finally allowed to actually engage an enemy, she would be fearing for her life all the time, and I think that makes a lot of sense. And of course, at the same time, Kyoraku is kind of like wallowing in his own sort of self-doubt and self-despair in the shadow world of Kageoni, but he comes to the realization that he must accept responsibility both for himself and for Nanao and for the actions and the choices they are making. And so he rises up behind her, takes the sword as well, and basically says, I'm right here, I'm behind you. He stops her from trembling and he says, together we can do this. And so basically Nanao realizes that her captain has always had her back. He will always have her back. And with that, she deflects Lille Barro's trompette ability and basically finishes him off in a single hit. Nanao then watches Kyoraku collapse from the strain of what is easily the hardest fight they've pretty much ever had. And then we skip ahead to 10 years later, where she's seen as, again, still the vice captain of the 1st Division and now helping to inaugurate Rukia Kuchiki in as captain of the 13th Division. And then, like I said, Nanao does very briefly appear in the brand new Hell chapter, which for all intents and purposes may as well be 687. And she doesn't do an awful lot. She basically just says to Okikiba, still acting as a co-vice captain, that she's going out to partake in this ritual where the vice captain's supposed to go to the human world and find some hollows to kill. And that's basically it for Nanao Ise. I think that, again, this is another example of a character who doesn't get that much screen time, but is pretty interesting in her own right. The idea of almost a pure Kido user is something that truly fascinates me, and much like Kido in and of itself, much like Tessai, much like Hachi, I really wish we'd seen more of it. And unfortunately, generally speaking, the Kido that Nanao showcases is not really that interesting, but it is kind of cool that she has effectively manufactured those Quincy barriers herself, which is something that, again, really showcases her prowess. But the most important thing for Nanao's character, in my opinion, is just watching her grow, watching her move out of Kyoraku's shadow, in a sense, to take on the responsibility of being the vice captain of the 1st Division, commanding that respect to even characters like Kenpachi. I think that's really awesome as well. And then getting that really human reaction from her in the fight with Lille Barro, where you kind of see the consequences of the way Kyoraku has been too overprotective of this character. If Nanao had appeared in the Fate Karakura Town arc and actually maybe had a skirmish with somebody, she wouldn't have been so terrified when the moment came to face Lille. But maybe she still would have been, but I really think that's supposed to be Kubo's way of showing us that this character has been basically denied any battle action almost her entire life by Kyoraku, because, again, in her backstory, you find out that he's had quite a controlling grip on most of her life, even if it's kind of from the shadows in a way. You find out in the backstory that she actually applied for assignment as a member of the Kido Corps, but was mysteriously instead took in by the 8th Division. Obviously, Kyoraku saw Nanao Ise and was like, she needs to come under my tutelage because I need to look after her for her mother's sake. And it's kind of cool. It's kind of interesting seeing how not only she's been molded by that kind of the way of living, but also the way she blossoms out of that at the end of the 1,000-Year Blood War arc and very much becomes her own person, I think is a really cool character turn. But that's essentially it for the character of Nanao Ise and this very random character analysis that I just pretty much decided I wanted to do on a whim. But I really hope you enjoyed it. Let me know in the comments below what you think of Nanao. If you enjoyed her character, if you enjoyed seeing her, like I said, grow into her own character as opposed to kind of living a life almost controlled by Kyoraku. And what you thought as well of the twist of her having not her own Zanpakuto, but the ceremonial Ise blade, Shinken Hakyoken. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. But until next time, guys, don't forget to hit subscribe, hit the like button if you enjoyed the video, and I'll catch you later. See ya.